Take this off. I don't know where to put this right now. I'm pretty sure my audio is on. That's okay.
No, your audio's on. You're good.
Yay! Okay, I'm gonna do this. Here we go. Okay. How's it going?
It's good. How are you?
I'm good. Actually no, I won't switch over to headphones. Good. We just had a little tune session in the main stage. I've been messing with the turntable I got, and it turned out surprisingly well. I was like, if I mix something that's at 130 BPM with something at 70 BPM, I swear to God. Thank you for joining us again for day 3 for younger students, Danny. We are so excited to have you.
Of course, I'm happy to be here.
Let me know when you have kind of your materials on the side. I'm happy to let me whip up. Okay, cool. I think we can start in like a minute. Let me see. My cat's active in the back. He's like, I can hear him hitting one of his toys. So active. Okay. Oh my God. Okay. Well, hello and welcome everyone to the Women in STEM Intersectionality Discussion. That was my pay rent alert. Okay. So some guidelines to follow at all times is to exercise consideration and respect in your speech and actions. Please alert conference staff if you notice a dangerous situation, someone in distress, or violations of our code of conduct. So thank you for coming, y'all. We are so excited for our intersectionality session. My name is Alia. I'm on the organizing committee, second year PhD student in computer science, they, she pronouns. Today I have the pleasure of introducing an amazing human being. Literally, I keep getting a lot of notifications left and right that are incredibly distracting. Oh my gosh. So when I was talking to Daniel, I go by Danny. I call him Danny because it's so endearing. But Daniel, I reached out to originally met in Sacramento when I lived there, and I was like, he's such an awesome resource for younger students in the LGBTQ plus community. So I asked him, hey, do you have some time to talk to younger students about intersectionality? He was like, yeah. And I was so excited that he said yes. So a little bit about Danny. Oh my gosh, sorry, toast. Daniel is a queer and trans social worker working for Sacramento City Unified School District and overseeing the LGBTQ plus support services program there. So he knows what he's talking about. And we also encourage everyone to be a part of this discussion too, and sharing your audio, your video, discussing things in the chat. We definitely welcome that. So with that said, take it away.
All right, well, let me get my screen sharing. And we are ready to go. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for coming to learn a little bit about intersectionality and hopefully have, a beautiful discussion about all of our intersecting identities. So, as Elia said, my name is Daniel. My pronouns are he and they. And I've worked with Sac City Unified for the past 4 years, working mostly with queer and trans youth. So I was excited to get the invitation to come and speak. So let us get going. Go ahead. So intersectionality first. Want to break down just the meaning. The term itself was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a law professor and social theorist. And she coined this term in her paper regarding demarginalizing the intersection of race and sex to speak to where feminist organizations and anti-racist organizations fall short and do a great disservice to folks who hold multiple identities As Audre Lorde is quoted saying, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. We're multifaceted people, and one aspect of our identity, doesn't necessarily mean that itself exists in a vacuum, that there isn't anything else that comes into play. And so intersectionality itself speaks to the interconnected nature of social categorizations. So we're talking about race, class, gender, socioeconomic status, you name it. And all of these sort of play a part in how we perceive the world and how we're walking through it. And then, also the way that we are perceived by the world and the way that we are treated. So for example, I am a queer person, I'm a trans person, I'm a Latinx person. However, I have a lot of like white assumed privilege, and being, a white assumed person, in most spaces. I mean, my name is what it is. And so that, creates a different sort of experience, than another queer and trans person of color, who walks through the world and is perceived as a person of color, 100% of the time. Which takes us to our sort of intersectionality wheel, and this is where we're going to be discussing, our own identities as well. So this is a portion that I definitely encourage folks to either if you're comfortable sharing your audio and video and jumping in, or if you want to drop something in the chat, you're more than welcome to as well. And so the way that this circle is set up is it allows us to look at all these different sort of pieces of identity. The center sort of being what we consider core to who we are, in terms of being a little more fixed over periods of time. So things like race, ethnicity, age, physical ability and qualities, gender, sexual orientation, those things. And while there is, fluidity in these pieces, particularly with things like gender and sexual orientation and physical ability, they largely remain fixed and largely are, the sort of first things about a person that are, recognized and received by others. And then on the outer part of the circle, we have things like parental status, geographic location, marital status, work background, things like that. And those further inform who we are as individuals. And so the activity that I'm hoping to kind of do with y'all, if you'll allow, is I would like folks to think about if they only had to choose 3 pieces of their identity from any part of this wheel, what 3 might those be? But they're just so core to who you are that if those 3 weren't what you had to like first introduce yourself to somebody, it just simply, wouldn't do you justice. And folks are welcome to, drop things into the chat, or if they'd like to share their audio or video, that would be lovely.
I'm thinking, I'm gonna go with, I'm like blanking out. First of all, this wheel's beautiful, so I'm just staring at it. But thinking style, I'm gonna go with, I feel like an essence of mine is just the way I communicate. I feel like if I lost that, I'd be really upset. And education, if I said that right, yeah, with that.
I see some folks sharing in the chat: gender, education, geographic location, gender, ethnicity, and location, ethnicity, gender, and education. So those are definitely, core pieces. And I think sometimes we can take for granted, our location. I know for myself, when I look at this, that isn't necessarily the sort of first, sort of community, like connection to a community in terms of feeling that as being a core to who I am. And so it's interesting seeing folks put that in there for themselves. And so, the idea of these three, pieces of our identity and what it means to just choose those three, is definitely a tough task to do because, again, we are multifaceted individuals, right? And if we were in person, this may be an exercise too to talk about what happens if one of those identities is crossed off, is essentially just erased. It's already hard enough to just pick the three, right? And so the idea of having to, um, you know, lose another essentially or have another taken from you, um, really takes apart or tears down who we are as individuals. And this is something that we do on a regular basis. Apologies for my animals in the background. I will pause for one moment. Okay, there are a lot of squirrels in our backyard, so it's a whole thing. But I was leading into the idea that we erase folks' identities every day. Um, you know, sometimes like unknowingly, unconsciously. But we do this through things like assuming people's pronouns, for example. We do this through assuming a person's gender, things about them. And we're all raised in a particular way to do those sort of social categorizations. Our brains are wired essentially to place people in the boxes that we were taught, exist and where folks belong. And so I encourage folks to, think about that. And, when you're connecting with another person, is it about like the things that you see as a similarity to you, something that you connect with personally? And are those the pieces of that person's identity that you value most? Or are we seeing a multifaceted individual and recognizing those differences and celebrating those things? I think often we're taught, well, we're all people, we're all human, we're all trying to get through, we should love and care for one another, which is true. We should all like care for one another and extend that sort of humanity to each other, right? But by limiting it to the idea that we can only connect with folks and only hold space and respect folks who have similar, identities to you, definitely limits our growth, limits our ability to extend empathy to folks who are different than ourselves. And so we want to think about seeing these differences, acknowledging them and honoring them, and knowing that just because a person is different than you, or maybe values different pieces of their identity at different levels than you do, is worth celebrating, is worth respecting, and we're all like worthy of occupying the space we do and having that be respected, right? And that leads me into this quote by W.E.B. Du Bois, and the idea is a system cannot fail those it was never meant to protect. And so, this speaks to the idea that we often hear, well, these systems are, broken, when we see these big injustices happening to communities of color, to queer and trans folks, right? And the idea of, the system needs some repair, but in fact, the system in which we live in and exist in is operating as it was intended, to separate the haves and the have-nots, to separate those with privilege and those who are marginalized, and keeping that sort of sense of social order, if so to speak. And so the idea that the system needs to be repaired is a false sort of idea, right? Because what we know is that it's something that we need to rebuild, something that needs to be approached with an intersectional mindset, and having really vulnerable discussions about who we are and what that means, and how that relates to the larger social systems that we belong to, like being a student, being in this field, and continuing forward. And so I want to talk a little bit about the examples of systemic isms and phobias and things like that. So this is where we see those biases come through and, have an impact in a very concrete way, in a way that is, just further supported by the system that currently exists. So, an example of a systemic, issue in the medical field, for example, would be, gender affirming services for routine checkups for trans folks. So the idea that folks are needing to, like myself, needed to receive a mental health letter, receive a referral from my primary care physician, get another backup letter, all confirming that the top surgery that I was electing to have as a trans person, and have the autonomy over my body to say what it is that I feel right doing, and what works for me, being something that has to then be verified by multiple individuals, at cost from my own pocket, right? So for a service that I would then also have to pay for. And so that's, the hoops that we're making folks jump through in order to get gender affirming care, as well as looking at services for routine checkups. Like, going to my primary care physician means hearing things like, oh, well, my trans patients usually know more about their health and their medical needs than I do, which was probably a display of humility and not necessarily knowing all of the things and being transparent with that. But that certainly doesn't make an individual feel comfortable or safe, going into a physician who their whole career is knowing how to, service you and know all of your sort of needs. And so things like routine checkups of just going in become discussions about like, well, this might be because of your hormones, but I don't actually know. So things like that. And then we go to, people of color and particularly Black women being denied care, and symptoms being dismissed. And we've seen this a lot throughout the pandemic, article after article of particularly Black women who are medical staff themselves being denied care from their colleagues, essentially, and their primary care physicians, because they are not listened to. We don't trust folks to know what's right for them and their bodies, if they don't belong to the sort of privileged, identity category, right? And we also know that studies in the medical field and every field essentially are done exclusively with white sample populations, exclusively with folks who are assigned male at birth. And so that has, its own set of ramifications for the way these products or services or medications or anything like that are distributed, the way that they may or may not be effective for, different bodies, for different, folks, right? So we have that issue, and we can see it in mental health. So, in the DSM, which is a diagnostical guide for clinicians, there is a specific designation for sexuality and for gender, and the idea of pathologizing those identities. So, in a previous edition of the DSM, like homosexuality was listed as a designation as a mental health disorder that needed to be treated. And so we see a rise in things like conversion therapy, which is still in existence and something that still happens, right? And that was then removed. However, something like gender identity and being a trans person is still listed as a diagnostic, as something that would need to be addressed as a mental health concern. And while the treatment plan for somebody with gender dysphoria is gender affirming care, there's still that need to have it listed as a disorder rather than, a piece of somebody's identity, right? And we can see that service providers are often less often reflect the population that they serve, and this is true for you know, the schools that we go to, the hospitals we go to, and things like that. And then we have microaggressions that are seemingly, you know, are things that we can't necessarily always pinpoint if we're trying to describe why we feel like we're being, you know, cast aside and things like that. You know, but they definitely add up and they become a weight to carry on a day to day. So things like you're so articulate, I don't see color, or I don't care if you're black, white, purple, polka dotted. You know, no, where are you really from? You're really pretty or handsome for a, you know, person of color, for a trans person, for a queer person. Things like you don't look trans, I couldn't even tell, or you're so inspiring for overcoming your disability, or oh, your name is hard to pronounce, I'll call you blank instead. And you know, in all of these statements, we see how our biases are coming through. These may be things that like we in this group have heard, or
100%.
yeah, or perhaps things in this group that we've once thought or you know, said as well because of the system that we ultimately all come up in, right?
Should we put on the chat, what are some things that you've experienced that you would deem as like a microaggression? Like things are like, if you have, anything that like you've come across that people have been like, they said something and you're like, it kind of made you do a double take. Oh yeah. Where are you really from? Same. I think all of these that you listed, Danny, I'm like, oh my God. Sarah, you don't even have an accent. Oh my gosh. People pick that up. You have to be.
Yeah, Maggie, the statement that you have of you have to be white, I definitely feel that as well. And I think that that's like also something that, you know, a lot of folks, and I mean, that takes us into like colorism, right? And this idea that if you, you know, are a biracial person, particularly, there's like this feeling of, you know, not really feeling connected with one community or the other because you're not enough of something in either sort of category or having these like feelings, whether that's from, you know, the folks in those circles or from our own like internalized feelings about what it means to be a biracial person. And so that definitely, you know, has an impact for sure.
See some high schoolers here. Welcome, high schoolers. Feel free to add any of your thoughts. Welcomed.
Or perhaps something, I mean, you've experienced in with any of your, you know, teachers, right? You know, we look to folks for who are like our educators, right, to you know, to know better. But the reality is, isn't always the case, right? There isn't necessarily, you know, consistency across the board with how much our, you know, teachers or professors are aware of their own identities and privileges and the way that their biases show through and the curriculums that they create. And so, you know, I think that there is definitely something to be said. And I see Sarah's comment of feeling like you need to straighten your hair from some events. Yeah, I that's definitely true. Like that is something that like you just know as a person who's like come up in you know, the culture that we're in, this idea that you know, professionalism looks a particular way, and we can see this when we're like applying for jobs or going into like you know, job interviews and things like that as well. It was like going in and dressing in a particular way, and what is something like what is deemed like appropriate dress code, I guess. What is considered like the appropriate and professional way to like wear your hair, or not have tattoos, or not wear like formal wear that is specific to our own individual cultures. And it's just like largely created by the folks that have made this system, right? That have said that the way to be a professional, the way to be received and as a professional, as a figure of authority, is to conform, essentially. And we know that that's not the way that the world is, and we know that that's not the best way for us to um, be able to grow and evolve as a whole community, right? I see a note for when achievements are qualified by because you're a minority, or for a, yeah, I definitely hear that. I think that there comes to be a panic from the folks who hold privilege when um, any other like marginalized group of people has access to the same spaces that they do, because we've set out the dichotomy of folks who are considered worthy because they're inherently able to occupy those spaces. And so when you have privilege and then others who haven't previously had it are able to access the same spaces, the same services, things like that, they view that as something being taken from them. The idea that it's not something that is open and available and should be open and available to the people who, you know, are working towards that. We just kind of diminish those things pretty quickly. And on the flip side of that, of being like, when your achievements are qualified because you're this or because you're that, we see like a lot of tokenizing happen also, like the idea that, if you're of a marginalized community, and then you're brought into a space, then being expected to be the authority on the whole community, being the person that everybody looks to for I don't know, to gauge their own like sense of wokeness, right? Of all of that pressure then falls on folks as well. And so I know we have just a few minutes left, and so I'd like to encourage folks, if you have any thoughts or feelings about the sort of information that we've talked about today, and how that's sitting with you, I'd like to offer the opportunity.
Audio, video, audio. We prefer chat. I just flash back to like, I love telling stories. So I'm gonna flash back real quick. So like my ex's dad, he and I would sit down and have these conversations about microaggressions, and he's this white guy, white man, like, and he was like, "Did you hear that California just passed this anti-hair discrimination law? How ridiculous is that?" And I was just like, Mike, Mike, look at your hair. Like you have little dainty, little thin white boy hair. Like you don't have to deal with anything of being discriminated against. And he was like, no, like I think that's like dumb or whatever. And I was just like, I flash back to that moment often when I have these kinds of discussions, because it's like it's just a total, like people find it to be, if it doesn't impact them, then it's not worth having like the kind of perspective about it. And I just, that is really frustrating. But I think that these kinds of spaces are what we need to be able to crack that open a bit more. Mm-hmm. Mike, I wish you were here. Actually, JK, no, I don't. Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, I think like it's hard, you know. I mean, having these conversations like require us to be really vulnerable. You know, whether we're a person with lots of different privileged identities or not, you know, having to be introspective and offer these things up and really question like, you know, what we know about ourselves based on what others tell us we should be or how we are going to be, things like that. It's a difficult conversation to have, and particularly if you've never had to have that before, and never had to think about it. Because sometimes people think like there's a thought of, well, I don't want to like own that I have any privileges because does that mean that I didn't earn my spot here? I was just like given to me, as though I didn't work for it, for example. But you know, the reality is it's just the fact that like none of those identities that that person holds was the reason that they didn't, or it wasn't like a part of the reason why they would or wouldn't like gain access to a space, right? So rather than thinking of it as, you know, being privileged then means that you have an automatic spot. It's more so about you can be assured that your identities aren't the reason you're not going to get that spot. And I think that that's a difficult concept for folks who maybe haven't had to really think about that before. And
Mm,
we feel scared and uncomfortable, and so we sort of reject new information. And I think the thing that will allow us to grow, to break open and heal, you know, stronger essentially from that, is you know, exhibiting some cultural humility of being okay with not knowing everything all the time. We as individuals can't possibly know everything, but what we can do is, you know, step out with the best intent, and assuming best intent for others who are also on their own paths, their own journeys of learning and finding the communities and the safe spaces, like this one, hopefully, where you're able to dive in deeper, with that sort of safe space, right?
yes, yes, very much so. I realize now that it's actually 9:30. Before we close out, if there are any burning questions, please feel free to ask, throw in the chat. But if there is not, um, Daniel, thank you so much for this conversation and like being able to just be here with us to talk to us about intersectionality, microaggressions, and provide a new perspective in the Women's STEM conference. So thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. You know, I was happy to, you know, be here and have this conversation with you.
Yeah. Okay, y'all. I also think that right now 9:30 is the career prep first step until 11. Okay. All right. Well, feel free to hop to that session as well. Thank you so much, Danny, and we will catch you over there.
All right, great. Have a good day, everybody.
Have a good day.